On behalf of Institute of Chinese Studies and India International Center, let me extend a very warm welcome to all of you to the VP Dutt Memorial Lecture by Ambassador Shyam Saran. It's indeed an honor for the ICS to co-host this lecture in memory of a leading sinologist and academic of the country, Professor VP Dutt. I thank the Indian International Center for joining us in organizing this prestigious lecture. Acknowledge the presence with us of Shri Ken Srivastava, Director, India International Center. I also thank VP Dutt, Gargi Dutt Foundation for the valuable support for this event and indeed for many other activities of the ICS. I acknowledge the presence of Ms. Anuradha Dutt, Managing Trustee of the Foundation. It's good to see such a large attendance for this webinar. We are live streaming this event on YouTube. We have ThePrint as a media partner for the event, and the recording will be made available on the YouTube channels of both ThePrint and the ICS after the event. We are organizing the VP Dutt and contributions for our most respected and pioneering China scholars and intellectuals. Professor Dutt was a historian with a deep knowledge of China's history, culture, literature, as also politics, foreign and strategic affairs. Having graduated in English literature from Lahore University, he was among the first few students from India to go to China under an exchange program in 1958. He completed his PhD from Stanford on China's 1911 revolution, then went on to Harvard University for postdoctoral studies. But he was more than just a narrowly focused historian. He was a multifaceted personality with rich contributions in many fields. He was a great China scholar, but also an institution builder, a foreign policy and strategic thinker, writer, and parliamentarian. His interests went well beyond China to include India's foreign policy and matters of public life, peace, and development. We recall, in particular, Professor Dutt's rich legacy as a teacher and mentor of a generation of emerging China scholars in India. He persuaded Pandit Nehru to support Chinese studies in India in the aftermath of the 1962 conflict, and thus the Center for China Studies at Delhi University came into existence in 1964. As you know, later this center became the Department of East Asian Studies. He was instrumental in launching a Ford Foundation-supported program under which young China scholars were sent to Hong Kong for language studies and to the USA for their PhDs, and they returned to form the core of the Center for China Studies at Delhi University. Working with a remarkable bunch of colleagues, including his spouse, Professor Gargi Dutt, another outstanding China scholar, Professor VP Dutt diligently promoted China studies in India. Along with that, he guided generations of students. He later served as the Pro-Vice Chancellor of the University and in the Rajya Sabha of Indian Parliament. With his myriad contributions and pioneering work, remember him today as a giant of China studies and academic life in India. Professor Dutt's students and colleagues included the pioneers of the ICS. We at the ICS therefore owe a special debt of gratitude to Professor VP Dutt. It's most befitting that we have with us to deliver this prestigious lecture Ambassador Shyam Saran, former Foreign Secretary, Prime Minister's Special Envoy, and Chairman of the National Security Advisory Board and the RIS. It's a matter of great honor for us that he's closely associated with the ICS as a member of its governing council. He's also life trustee of the IIC. As you know, Ambassador Shyam Saran is one of the most respected China scholars and strategic thinkers of the country. The remarkable body of writings and speeches to his credit is prolific, and his writings and interventions are incisive and full of insights. It always amazes me how he can invariably offer fresh perspectives while exploring a wide range of themes, old and new. Ambassador Shyam Saran will speak today on a very interesting theme of how India-China relations have been influenced by Chinese encounters with British imperialism, with Indians playing the role of instruments of British depredations in China, including dumping of opium on China. These perceptions continue to shape Chinese attitudes and policy towards India in contemporary times. We are all looking forward to this very important lecture. I will now invite Shri Ken Srivastava, Director, India International Center, to make his remarks. Over to you, Ken.
Thank you, Ashok. Ambassador Shyam Saran, Ambassador Ashok Anta, and friends. My greetings to all of you on this occasion. India International Center and Institute of Chinese Studies have been conducting several collaborative programs every year, the focus being India-China relationship. As a matter of fact, our two institutions will be signing an MOU very soon to formalize this collaborative relationship. This program we would have loved to conduct in physical mode at IISc, but the pandemic has prevented us from doing so. I'm sure future programs very soon we will be having in physical mode at IISc. Friends, I was one of those fortunate officers who was part of Rajiv Gandhi's entourage when he made a visit to China in 1988. At that time, I was working as a PS to Mr. Natwar Singh, who was Minister of State in External Affairs Ministry then. The kind of enthusiasm which was generated in both India and China, I still remember. Thereafter, I was associated with setting up of Wensang Memorial with Chinese collaboration at Nalanda. All these years since 1988, we have been only seeing increasing or multiplying the economic relationship between India and China. But suddenly all those things have changed. In the last couple of months, ever since this standoff has started. So therefore, it has now forced us to rethink over our China strategy, and who else can tell us as to what can be done to re-strategize ourselves in this matter than Ambassador Shyam Saran, who over his long diplomatic career spanning over more than 3.5 decades has dealt with China-India relationship very, very closely. We are indeed very fortunate to have him here, and I'm sure he will be telling us many more things which are hitherto not known to most of us. Ambassador Ashok Anta has already spoken about Mr. Shyam Saran, but I would also like to add to that. He is our life trustee, India International Center's life trustee. He is indeed a very erudite speaker, a thinker, a scholar, and he has got amazing analytical mind. I'm sure he will be able to enlighten us about many other aspects of India-China relationship today. Friends, on this occasion, I also join all of you in remembering Professor V.P. Dutt and also in paying homage to him on this occasion. His contribution in terms of establishing Center for Chinese Studies at Delhi University will always remain memorable. So with these few words, I end here. I once again thank ICS and to all of you for this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your very thoughtful remarks. I will now invite Ms. Anuradha Dutt, well-known lawyer and daughter of Professor V.P. Dutt, and also managing trustee of V.P. Dutt Gargi Dutt Foundation, to speak. Over to you, Anuradha ji.
Well, I can only tell you that the dedication and commitment of Dr. Dutt and Mrs. Dutt was so high that I was born in China back in. And I think the last lecture that I heard of Professor Dutt was in Sapru House in 2010, December, when he said that China is going to always provoke you, but it'll never attack you. So what has happened since then and now, I would love to hear Ambassador Shyam Saran also. Thank you.
Thank you for those remarks, short and sweet. Now, before I invite Ambassador Shyam Saran to deliver his lecture, let me explain a few ground rules here. Ambassador Saran has indicated that he'll be delivering his lecture for about 30-35 minutes, when we'll mute all other participants. Thereafter, Ambassador Saran has kindly agreed to take questions from the participants. You may indicate your interest in asking questions by using the raise hand option available at the bottom of the list of participants. You may also send me your questions through the chat option. I will call on participants to ask their questions during the Q&A session after the lecture is over. The concerned participants will be unmuted. Now I have great pleasure inviting Ambassador Shyam Saran to deliver the VP Dutt Memorial Lecture.
Thank you very much, Ashok, and also my thanks to Mr. K. N. Srivastava, Director of India International Center, to Mr. Anuradha Dutt, who's Managing Director of the VP Dutt and Gargi Dutt Foundation. Thank you for your very generous introduction, Ashok and Mr. Srivastava. Yes, it is perhaps worthwhile to try and decode why India-China relations have moved away from a rather positive trajectory that we have seen over the past several decades into once again a phase of confrontation and tension. But my intention today is not to really look at the current situation, but to try and see if there are in recent history or ancient history, are there factors which perhaps influence the manner in which China, for example, looks at India. And my purpose in doing this is to try and see whether by analyzing, by exploring some of those phases of history, we are able to perhaps manage India-China relations better than perhaps has been the case so far. So the period that I'm focusing on is really the period of British colonialism in India, and how that colonial empire in India interfaced with China. And in that interface, what is the agency of the Indians themselves? And how were they perceived in China when British imperialism was also, in a sense, expanding its influence into East Asia and in particular China. So that's the period that I'm looking at to see whether we can find in that particular period some of the sort of sources of some of the negative perceptions that China has towards India. Now, before I do that, of course, I would like to pay tribute to Professor V.P. Dutt and Srimati Gargi Dutt, whose memory we are honoring today. Let me just say that, I was very fortunate to know them personally, to also have many discussions with them about China and developments in India-China relations. And as has been pointed out, he was one of the pioneer sinologists in India, and was also responsible for training a very large number of China scholars, diplomats, who have made a name for themselves. So he played a very important role in the promotion of China studies in India. I will not go into details because that has already been spelled out by both Ashok and Mr. Srivastava. So let me try and get into the main part of my talk. So as you know, India and China, of course, enjoyed more than 1,000 years of uninterrupted trade and cultural exchanges during the first millennium after Christ. This enduring engagement flowed across the Central Asian bridgehead, through the Tibetan Plateau, and the maritime links connecting peninsular India with the eastern seaboard of China. Now, the spread of Buddhism in China became the prism through which China perceived India at that particular time. And these interconnections were, yes, often interrupted by political turmoil and transitions in both countries, as well as in the intermediary realms. However, it would be generally correct to say that during the second millennium, these interruptions became more extended and relations became more distant. Of course, you had, in India, you had the invasions from the west, and also later on, of course, British colonialism itself. But this was a period where many of the connections between India and China were interrupted, and the kind of familiarity which was there earlier between the two countries, that familiarity slowly sort of faded away. They were not completely broken, but they did fade away. Now, as I said, the engagement continued, but at a certain lower pitch, and often through their peripheries rather than between the centers of the two countries. So, for example, the port of Calicut maintained a very flourishing maritime trade with China in the medieval period. It was described as a pivot point for the 7 voyages undertaken by the Ming Dynasty Admiral Shanghai, who actually died in Calicut in 1433 at the end of the last 7th voyage. The Ming Emperor then, after that, forbade further maritime expeditions, and China descended into a kind of a studied insularity, which continued under the ensuing Qing dynasty under the Manchus. Now, the Qing harbored inherited notions of India as a land of Buddhism lying to the west, or as it was known then as Scythian, or the Western paradise, but could not reconcile this with reports about a Mughal empire then ruling in that geography. So the geography itself was adjusted to locate India to the south of what was then the Mughal empire. And the fall of the Mughals in the 18th century and the emergence of British colonial rule in India, with all its implications for China, was only vaguely understood in China. It is with the Opium Wars of 1839 to 42, and then again 1856 to 60, that China was deeply shaken by its vulnerability to a British empire in the east, which drew its power and resources from the colonial empire in India. The opium, for example, which drained China of silver and enfeebled its citizens, and the Indian soldiers who served as the shock troops during the humiliating wars, led the Qing court and Chinese intellectuals to examine the reasons behind Chinese weakness. And associated with this was, of course, also an exploration of the Indian condition and its role as a springboard for the painful assault on China. There emerged in parallel a deeply negative popular perception of Indians from their role as the street side enforcers of British rule in the concessions. There was also the deep resentment of the prominent Indian traders who flaunted the wealth gained from the opium trade in cities like Shanghai. Now, Chinese intellectuals, whether conservative reformers like Kang Youwei and Liang Qichao, or more radical figures like Chen Tuxiu, Lu Xun, or Liang Shuming, saw India as, quote, worst case scenario for China. India's past as a brilliant and sophisticated civilization was acknowledged, but its more recent history was of special relevance to China if it were to be successful in confronting the powerful Western challenge. Interestingly, though Japan had defeated China in 1894-95, it was seen in China as having succeeded in becoming a modern nation and therefore a model to be emulated. Several Chinese students and scholars headed to Japan around the turn of the century to learn from its example. In contrast, India was regarded, as my title of the lecture says, as a teacher by negative example. A failed and fallen country which had been subjugated and enslaved virtually without resistance of its people. As pointed out by a Japanese scholar at that time, Shimada, quote, reformers and radicals alike shared the anxiety that China not follow in the footsteps of India, unquote. Kang Youwei was an advocate of constitutional monarchy with the Meiji Restoration of Japan as the model. He became an advisor to the Kwangshu Emperor and is associated with the 100 Days of Reform. But he fell victim to the powerful reactionary clique around the Empress Dowager Cixi. He went into exile to escape execution, and it is during his exile that he visited India during 1901 to 1903, and then again later in 1909. It is from India that he criticized the move by some reformers for Kwangtung province to declare independence, adopt radical reforms, and then seek to overhaul the reactionary Qing monastery at the center. And here is what he wrote to his own student, Liang Qichao. Quote, my 4 billion compatriots, these are 4 million compatriots then of Kwangtung. If you wish to become a fallen nation of slaves, then quickly support the fight for independence in all provinces like the Indian people have done. But if, my compatriots, you do not wish to become a fallen nation or an exterminated race, then you should deem useless India's fight for independence in all its provinces, unquote. So this is the kind of language you see from one of the great intellectuals of the early 20th century. Here, of course, what Kang was trying to do was to compare Kwangtung with Bengal, which had fallen prey to the British because of the failure of the various princely states of India to present a united front under a strong central authority. Other Chinese intellectuals sought to explain India's plight as a colonized country on the inherent character of its people. So it is not only that British colonialism was powerful and very oppressive, but maybe the people of India themselves were responsible for the plight which they found themselves in. In his earlier writings, another Chinese intellectual of the time, Chang Tai-yen, argued that Indian people were specially susceptible to British occupation after the experience with the Mongols and then the Mughals. So he says, and I quote, by the time the Mughals unified the land, the Indian people had already pledged their allegiance to a different people. To be owned by the Mughals and then to be owned by the British, what difference did it make to them? Unquote. Then the weather in India was also cited as a reason for Indian laziness and lack of vigor. So again, he says, don't you know, in the tropics, people do not go cold and hungry. Therefore, people become lazy and things go easily rotten. They are weaker than you, and he's addressing Kang Youwei, than you saw, unquote. These scholars did not see the irony of their blaming Indians' deficient character for becoming prey to foreign rule and ignoring their own country's history of being conquered and ruled by the alien Mongols in the 12th and 13th century, and later by the Manchus during the 17th to the 20th century. During this phase, even the positive history of Buddhism as a factor of affinity between the two countries was interpreted negatively. So you had Liang Shuming, for example, saying that for the reinvigoration of China, Indian influence must be eliminated and not a trace of it be allowed to survive in China. Some years later, and this is perhaps better known, Hu Shi, another Chinese intellectual, took up this theme and argued in an address at the Harvard University in 1937 that Chinese weakness in confronting Japanese aggression was due to the, quote, Indianization of China, unquote. India, he said, conquered and dominated China culturally for 20 centuries without ever having to send a single soldier across the border, unquote. But he meant this as a baneful influence on China to be exorcised rather than to be celebrated. It is often misinterpreted in India as a grateful Chinese acknowledgement of its cultural debt to India, when it is actually the opposite in intent. Rajnath Singh, the Indian Defense Minister, in October 2017, in fact, very approvingly quoted Husserl's remarks as evidence of China's cultural debt to India, only to invite a very prompt and angry refutation by Global Times, the Chinese newspaper. Rabindranath Tagore's visit to China in 1924 has been described as a milestone in India-China relations. The suggestion that it rekindled a sense of affinity between the peoples of the two countries and promoted solidarity in the struggle against Western imperialism is actually an exaggeration. He may have been received with polite courtesy and enjoyed respect as a Nobel laureate, but his notions of a rejuvenated Eastern civilization, which would include India and China, prevailing over a materialistic and spiritually bankrupt West, in fact found no resonance. Eastern civilization, as the Chinese saw it, did not include India, though perhaps it may include Japan. Left-wing intellectuals such as Lu Xun, Kuomoro, Shen Yanbing, Chantu Xiu, and Chu Qiubai were all critical of Tagore's ideas, even though they admired his scholarship and poetry. Shen Yanbing, for example, said that, quote, "We are determined not to welcome the Tagore who loudly sings the praises of Eastern civilization, nor do we welcome the Tagore who creates the paradise of poetry and love and leads our youth into it so that they might find comfort and intoxication in meditating," unquote. Chu Qiubai was more dismissive, describing Tagore as a man of the past whose advice was irrelevant. The claim made by Japanese scholar Shigenobu Okura had greater resonance among the Chinese when he said, quote, "Of the nations of Asian civilization today, I consider Japan to be the greatest, of course. Next is China. As for the people of Babylon and India, even though their cultures could be admired in bygone days, now they cannot even be compared," unquote. So the Chinese audience might have contested the Japanese claim to be number one, but would not have disagreed with his subsequent proposition relating to India. Individual Chinese interactions with Indians sometimes produce a more favorable impression. Chang Tai Yuan himself became interested in Buddhism when he was in prison for about 3 years. And his extended conversations with an Indian friend later, when he was in Tokyo, led him to believe that Indians and the Hans should work in solidarity to rid their peoples of British and Manchu alien rule respectively, and that China could draw inspiration from India's own struggle for freedom. There were other Chinese individuals who were deeply influenced by Tagore and accepted his invitation to live and teach at Shantiniketan, and they, of course, included scholars like Tan Yun Shan and Wu Xiaoling and artists like Xu Beihong. Wherever there were opportunities for direct engagement and conversations, the more prejudiced notions could be contested. Unfortunately, much of Chinese and Japanese readings of India during the first decades of the 20th century were derived through translations of British colonial literature, which were openly and even crudely racist in their depictions of India and its people. It is these mediated perceptions which have remained entrenched in Chinese attitudes. As pointed out earlier, Chinese popular attitudes to India and Indians during this period was influenced by the use of Indian soldiers and policemen in the British depredations in China. In a Chinese novel from 1904, which has been quoted by the scholar T.H. Barrett, we have the following passage, and I quote, "Shirbao," is the name of the Chinese character in the novel, "Shirbao looked closely at these people, and they all had faces black as coal. They were wearing a piece of red cloth round their heads like a tall hat, Around their waist, they wore a belt holding wooden clubs. Shirbao asked the old man, "Are these Indians?" The old man said, "Yes. The English use them as policemen." Shirbao asked, "Why do they not use an Indian as the chief of police?" The old man answered, "Who ever heard of that? Indians are people of a lost country. They are no more than slaves." Unquote. Later in the story, some of those wearing those red hats are seen actually to be Chinese. And this too is a warning of what may happen to the Chinese people were they to fall prey to foreign rule. This is another example of India serving as a negative example. Did things change after India gained independence in 1947 and China achieved liberation in 1949? Did these attitudes from the early decades of the 20th century persist, or was there change in the Chinese discourse on India? In reviewing India-China relations over the past 7 decades, we see the following pattern. When India-China relations are in a positive phase, for whatever reason, there is an invariable harking back to the shared Buddhist heritage and the history of dense trade and cultural exchanges. There may even be references to mutual sympathy and support during the more contemporary period of India's struggle for independence and China's liberation movement, though the evidence for this is somewhat more limited. However, whenever relations have become strained and contentious, the disparaging and negative narratives of the more recent past surface not only in Chinese media, but also in records of Chinese leaders' conversations, for example, with foreign interlocutors. Negative media reports concerning India and Indian leaders are very well documented. Before the Hindi-Chini bhai-bhai phase in the early 50s, India was actually considered as an instrument of Western imperialism. Its independence and non-alignment was supposed to be only in name. Then the Tibet crisis in 1959 led to another phase of very negative reporting on India, including the infamous People's Daily article attributed to Mao himself entitled, quote, "On Nehru's philosophy," unquote. But it is in the record of several private conversations which Chinese leaders had with foreign interlocutors that the attitude of contempt against India comes out most clearly. I will cite here some of Zhou Enlai's observations about India and Nehru in conversations with Kissinger, for example, in 1972. One of the references is that Zhou referred to Nehru's discovery of India, saying that Nehru was thinking of a great Indian empire, but, quote, "Actually, India is a bottomless hole," unquote. And then again, he says, "India is a highly suspicious country. It is quite a big country, but sometimes it puts on airs of a big country, but sometimes it has an inferiority complex," unquote. And then Kissinger at one point says, India has been governed by foreigners through most of its history. And Zhou says, yes, that might be one of the historical factors. And there is another incident which is very revealing. Zhou here talks about his participation at a reception given by Nehru. And here is what he says. "Nehru invited me to a tea party in his garden, and among the guests, there were 2 people in costume. There were 2 Tibetan lamas, and suddenly there appeared a female lama. 'Do you know who she was?' he asked Kissinger. And Kissinger says, 'Madam Bin,' the Vietnamese leader. And Zhou says, 'No, Madam Gandhi,' and starts laughing. She was dressed up entirely in Tibetan costume. That was something that Nehru was capable of doing. I was speechless, confronted with such a situation." Now, just the exchange just goes to show that it is not India which is a highly suspicious country, but China. I mean, he thought that Mrs. Gandhi appearing in a Tibetan costume was in some way, asserting India's control over or sovereignty over Tibet. I mean, this was the kind of notion that he was trying to put across. During my second tenure in China from 1983 to 86, Relations between the two countries had already taken a rather positive turn. There were exchanges of high-level visits, a regular dialogue on the boundary issue, and an expansion of trade and economic relations. It was in 1984 that the first ever visit to India by a very high-level delegation from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences took place. Perhaps Ashok might also recall this visit. It was led by its then President Ma Hong, a most distinguished economist, credited with the introduction of market-oriented reforms in China. His delegation was in India for about 2 weeks, visiting several cities. He also made a pilgrimage to Bodh Gaya. When he returned, his delegation returned, I invited him and some senior members of his delegation to dinner, and just sought to learn of his impressions of India. And while he praised India's development and gave high marks for its economic self-reliance, he could not resist remarking that on the surface, India appeared to be chaotic and disorderly. He and his colleagues were puzzled, he said, how the country was still functional. He narrated an incident that occurred on the delegation's car ride from Patna to Bodh Gaya. The car had to stop as there was some angry demonstration taking place, and had blocked the road. And the police in the patrol car accompanying the delegation then got out and started begging the demonstrators, cajoling them to give way to the vehicles. The demonstrators were not afraid of the police. I mean, this is what shocked Mao. And he said, this was unthinkable in China. The authority of the state was indispensable to political stability, and he wondered whether this was not a weakness in India. A more positive reflection was about the strength of Indian culture, despite the fact, he said, that India, unlike China, had been open to the world. Its classical music had maintained deep roots, and its women, at that time at least, still favored the elegant sari. With the recent opening up of China, he said, there had been a wholesale rush towards westernization. He complained that Chinese children wanted to learn how to play the violin and the piano, not the pipa or the chin, the Chinese traditional instruments. Chinese women wanted to wear Western skirts. They did not want to wear the qipao, the traditional dress. So on India's economic prospects, he conveyed a degree of skepticism because of its bewildering diversity and lack of community spirit, as he said. Even in these observations, very politely conveyed, we see echoes of the earlier perceptions and critiques of India. Post the clashes in Eastern Ladakh, we again notice a relapse into abusive language. One recent article, translated by our colleague at ICS, Hemant Ardalaka, calls Indians, quote, big-time thieves. And the author goes on to make blatantly racist comments, unquote, while talking, their gestures such as shaking of head, gesticulating, touching mouth, shaking eyebrows, making signs, etc., and so on. However, without harmful intentions, these can be very unnerving, unquote. And then it talks about the 1962 border talks, 1960 border talks. I think he's referring to 1960, although this says 1962. Anyway, I will quote this. During the early negotiations in 1962, the Indian side even proposed Tibet belonged to India, that Sichuan province be declared a demilitarized zone, and last but not the least, they even demanded that the Indian army be permitted to be stationed at Chengdu in order to monitor the implementation of the demilitarized zone. The Chinese representatives were stunned, unquote. Yeah, so are the Indians, that something like this can be actually truly believed in. We see that a line runs through the negative and derogatory perceptions of India and Indians that took hold during the British colonial period. While India's past glory as a great civilization was conceded, in contemporary times, it became an example of a failed and fallen country in Chinese perceptions. The reason for this decline was said to be the slavish character of its people and the lack of a strong central political authority to mobilize the people to resist foreign aggression. The depictions of Indians bordered on being racist. These impressions were also derived by translations into Chinese or Japanese of writings by British colonial authors who justified British colonial rule as a civilizational mission of redeeming a race which had lost any civilizational attributes it may have once had and lacked any ethics or scruples. India was held up as a teacher by a negative example. India's present then was the future that would await China if it did not unite and maintain strong central authority. These negative attitudes persist and surface whenever relations started to worsen. During more positive phases, these attitudes are masked and the rhetoric harks back to the ancient period of civilizational engagement between the two countries, though even in this case, the spread of Buddhism in China from India was regarded, at least by some intellectuals, as a baneful external influence which must be thoroughly exorcised to allow the true Chinese spirit to emerge. In dealing with the China challenge, India needs to analyze these deeper strands in Chinese perceptions of India and the prism through which Chinese mind interprets Indian foreign policy behavior. These perceptions are mediated through third-party sources and not direct experience of India and Indians over an extended period of time. I dare say that Indian perceptions of China are also covered by images and imaginings purveyed by others, but in the main, the English language discourse on China. This is a discourse which has at times romanticized the China story and at times disparaged it. Currently, we find that China is increasingly assessing India through the prism of its fraught and worsening relations with the United States. India is not regarded as having independent agency. For the Chinese pessimists, the future could relive the past in which India became the platform for an assault on China and hence needs to be neutralized well in time. Its people and leaders cannot be trusted because they are by nature and not by calculation given to petty intrigues and trickery. Sometimes, as we have seen, history may be rewritten or reinterpreted to fit preconceived notions about an adversary's character. This points to the need for more intensive China studies, in particular on its history, its culture and society, and the patterns of thought that are ingrained among its people. This exercise has two advantages. One, it points the way to slowly but steadily removing the sludge of prejudice which animates much of Chinese behavior towards India. Two, it opens the way for chipping away at our own prejudices and uninformed notions about China and the Chinese people, thereby making a more productive India-China engagement more likely, even if not inevitable. It is this cause of mutual awareness and understanding which Professor V.P. Dutt and Srimati Gargi Dutt sought to inculcate among their academic associates and students. This is a very precious legacy which needs to be affirmed and taken forward in earnest. I would like to thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that brilliant lecture, sir. Your lecture was frank, candid, insightful, well-researched. You questioned many of the stereotypes about how India is viewed in China, perceptions about China and India. And you pointed out that there might be recollections of so-called glorious past of India, but in contemporary China, perceptions are more likely than not being shaped. Perceptions of India are more likely than not being shaped by the colonial period, where India was seen as a failed and fallen country, as you mentioned, and how in China an effort was made to exorcise the baneful influence of India. Thank you very much for outlining how history has influenced the contemporary trajectory of India-China engagement, for exploring the fascinating construct of India being seen in China as a teacher by negative example, for bringing out how the Chinese perceptions of India continue to be shaped by memories of the British colonial period. As you have rightly pointed out, it's an understudied subject which needs to be explored much more. I'll suggest that this is a very apt theme for a lecture in memory of Professor V.P. Dutt, a historian with a strong contemporary preoccupations. We'll now open the floor for questions to the participants. You may ask questions by raising hand or through the chat box option. I see there are already some questions in the chat box. May I, invite Mr. Kishore Dere to pose his first question.
Thank you, Ashok. Thank you, sir, Ambassador Shyam Saran, for that brilliant exposition. For a country that itself suffered a fairly ignominious past of exploitation by colonial powers, as they have readily admitted, a century of humiliation, isn't it a bit rich for them to use that period as a benchmark to highlight the superiority of their own culture or their own system, intrinsically superior to the kind of culture and system that we had during the colonial age? And would you agree that a fair bit of the perception that China today has of India is also molded by the ideological underpinnings that came about due to the rise of Marxism in China? And the models that we followed, the models that they followed, being so diametrically opposite one from the other. As Mao had said, that a revolution is not a dinner party, it's not writing an essay or painting or anything quite as leisurely as that. And that was a period that was juxtaposed with Gandhi's advocacy of peace and non-violence. So there must have been an element of, sort of derision and looking down upon the means that India had adopted to the path of emancipation and independence. And Mao, of course, was also known to have said that Indian soldiers were tofu soldiers, at a certain point of time. But would you agree that ideology and Marxism played a fair bit of a role in their view, the kind of view that holds today? You did touch upon the Boxer revolution, 1900, and the fact that when the 8 nations sent their forces in, our Sikhs, Rajputs and Jats were in the vanguard of entering Peking. And you recall that in 1994, late General B.C. Joshi returned one of those 16 bells that had been taken from the Temple of Heaven. But the point is, as you rightly pointed out, those images also carry. But my point is about ideology. The paths that we took, particularly in the first half of the 20th century, does that determine to a great extent their perception of India?
Well, Marxism and the particular sort of trajectory which the Chinese liberation movement took certainly is a factor. But I would submit that it was much wider than that. So as I have pointed out, it was not only the Chinese left-wing intellectuals like Chen Tuxiu, for example, or Guo Moruo or Chu Qiubai, but also Kang Youwei was by no means a Marxist, and several of the other scholars who actually began this whole discourse of India as a teacher by negative example. These were not Marxists to begin with. So maybe the Marxist ideology reinforced some of these perceptions, but it was not limited to the Marxists alone. Secondly, also this whole business of revolution necessarily having a violent character was also contrasted with, as I mentioned, the image of Indians as being very lazy, as being very soft, not really ready to fight for themselves. So all these kind of very prejudiced kind of perceptions of Indians, these were only reinforced, So when we are looking at the success of the Chinese liberation and China having achieved liberation in 1949, the Indian independence movement was not seen as an emancipation of the people of India as there was emancipation of the people of China. Because the Indian emancipation was, in a sense, somewhat hollow, because India continued to be a kind of a, as the phrase went there at that time, a running dog of imperialism. The fact that India decided to continue to be a member of the Commonwealth, for example, if you look at the commentary on that, it just goes to show that they are not actually independent. They are following the Westerners. So there was I think, a much broader negative perception of India. May have been somewhat more in some quarters, less in other quarters, but it was fairly general. And don't forget, the small bit I quoted from Barrett about this novel from 1904. Which is basically popular literature, and what is the kind of image that is projected there of the Indians. So it was not just limited to just the intellectuals. It was actually something that had gone deeper into popular perceptions because of the use of Indian soldiers and Indian police in many of these encounters and many of the concessions that the Western countries have had.
I'll now invite Professor Hemant Adlakha to pose his question.
Thank you, Ambassador Saran, for your very thought-provoking presentation, perhaps aimed at breaking the stereotype perceptions both in China and India of each other. May I point out, I have also come across a large number of reportage and other personal accounts by many Chinese nationals who have in recent years lived and spent relatively long years in India and then gone back and written about it. One such recent article wondered why the Chinese do not explore how come so many Indians today are the CEOs of numerous MNCs and TNCs. So my question is, thanks to the internet and alternative sources of information, in China too, there are independent, quote unquote, as well as positive views on and of India. Please comment.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's why I said that at the individual level, there may be, positive evaluation of India and also a positive image of individual Indians. It's a bit like Pakistan and India, that at the personal level, sometimes you have very good relations, but, at the collective level, it is a very different story. And here, I think the fact is that as far as the decision-making levels in China are concerned, and also the kind of attitudes which you see amongst a lot of the intellectuals, the more dominant attitude is what I spoke about. And yes, wherever there has been extended engagement between Indians and Chinese, there has been a dilution of that prejudice on both sides. I even quoted the example of Chang Thai-yen, who started by having a very negative attitude about India and the Indians. But thanks to the very extended conversations that he had with an Indian friend, his Indian name unfortunately has not been given by him, but he refers to the extensive conversations that he had, which gave him an insight into Indian history, that gave him an insight into, really the kind of, independence struggle that India was involved in. And he ended up very much admiring what the Indians were doing at that time, and the Indian, and said that, China could learn a great deal from the Indian independence movement. So it is not that you did not have people in China before and even today who have a less prejudiced view of India, but the dominant perception is, I am afraid, a negative one. And what we see in those individual encounters, a lesson for the importance of direct, contact, direct conversations and engagement, rather than letting impressions be formed through third-party sources. So I refer to the fact that there is a body of opinion which is very much, or was certainly very much, influenced by the West at a certain point of time, really romanticizing China, really sort of building up China's image. And then now you have, of course, the other end of the spectrum, where everything that China is doing is bad. China is the aggressor. China is the country which is trying to dominate the whole world. We have very little space for somewhat more balanced kind of opinion of one another. And what I have tried to submit at the end is that it is very important for a relationship which is as important as is going to be even more important for the future, that there should be a much greater understanding, much greater familiarity with each other than has been the case so far.
I'll now invite Ambassador Vijay Nambiar to ask his question. Ambassador Nambiar.
Thank you, Shyam, for a very, very enlightening and very perceptive kind of delving into history. There is, however, this is ultimately a set of stereotypes which we have, which the Chinese have about India, and which India also has about China, perhaps at least at the base level itself. But particularly at the intellectual level, at the leadership level, while there were very many nuances, and as you know, the 24 Tagore visit, he was even given a Chinese name, Chu Chun Tan, and things like that. Yeah, and there was people like Liang Chichao were very, very appreciative of the international role he played and of his moral conscience and things like that. Of course, that was at a public level, and there was a deep sort of sense of. I think the question I want to ask is there a certain sense of inferiority, intellectual inferiority, which actually is behind this? Whether it's with regard to Jawaharlal Nehru, whether it's with regard to Mahatma Gandhi or with Tagore, you have noticed, at least at historical times when they've been faced with the relative historical role they have played in India, it's so different from China that at many levels there may be a sense of inferiority. And this, in fact, even ties up with what Hemant has just said. Today, at a popular level, when people look at it in a digital age, they're seeing so many Indian managers, etc., internationally. There's a strong sense of, how is it that they manage to that Indians manage to, in a sense, charge out on the international horizon? Is there some sense of a kind of a complex that they have?
You see perhaps a reflection of that in Chou En-lai telling Kissinger that the Indians suffer from an inferiority complex. But if you look at what he is saying, in fact, I haven't quoted the entire conversation, but if you go through that conversation, this aspect comes out very clearly, that there is a sense that, these Indians think too much of themselves. They think of themselves as being somewhat superior being. And that is also, sort of reflected in what Hemant said. But I think more important is, there is a certain cosmopolitanism of India, which China does not have. Despite the fact that it has been globalizing, despite the fact that its prosperity is actually a creature of globalization. And yet, they find it very difficult to be a global citizen. Indians, on the other hand, take to it almost naturally. See, the adaptability to very different cultures, different environments is much more on the Indian side. So I think this is something which is also reflected. I think you may recall a article which came out after the Galwan incident, where it was bemoaning the fact that despite the fact that China is so powerful, despite the fact that China has been giving so much, assistance and support to so many countries, and yet China seems to be isolated. And what explains that? See, a question being asked actually by the commentator, how is it that, we don't seem to have many friends around? So yes, I grant that there is that element of, I would say, sort of concealed jealousy or envy of India, which also, plays a certain role. Well, I mean, you look at the mirror image in India in terms of what I call dictator envy. That, oh, look at what the Chinese have been able to achieve, because of the fact that they are a centralized empire. We did not have to actually use violence to fight for our independence, but they did. And this, this is the reason why they have such vigor and such power. That is very much there. But as you said right in the beginning, that there are these stereotyped images on both sides, which at least we should make a start in terms of addressing that. There is far too little familiarity in India about what China is all about. And it's not about its foreign policy. It's not about its security policy. It is about, what is Chinese history? What is Chinese culture? What are the templates of the past which still, act as drivers in terms of how they see the world? There is a prism through which they look at the world. And that prism is very much impacted by their historical experience. That understanding, I am afraid, is still somewhat limited in India.
Thanks. There is a question in the chat box by Mr. Mahendra Kumawat. He wants to know, how is Gandhi viewed in China?
Well, there has been very little, in fact, commentary on Mahatma Gandhi. As I try to point out, that during the phases where India-China relations have been on a positive trajectory, the commentary on Mahatma Gandhi has also been positive. And also, for example, going to the Samadhi and giving bouquets there. There is a Chinese, knowing that he's such a revered figure in India, do in fact take that into account. But do they see Mahatma Gandhi's ahimsa, satyagraha as actually being something that is a model for other countries? Certainly not a model for China. That much is clear. So he does not, his ideas do not find much resonance in China. Let me put it that way.
There's a question by Mr. Arjun Khanna in chat box. Mr. Khanna, would like to pose your question briefly?
So my question is pretty simple and straight. It's that if China views India the way you described it in your wonderful lectures, there's an element of laziness, so they're indolent, these kind of negativities, and a lack of an ability to preserve themselves and stand up for themselves. The question is that till 1947, Pakistan was a part of the subcontinent and of the nation India. And still they view Pakistan as an all-weather ally now. So when there were similar people or people that were part of this country, why would the perceptions be so different? Or what is the perception of that country vis-a-vis India today?
The role of Pakistan is as an ally is not necessarily related to what the Chinese think of Pakistan as a country and as a people. China is looking at Pakistan from the point of view of its strategic interests. Now, it may even be that Pakistan as a somewhat corrupt country, Pakistan as so totally preoccupied with the so-called Indian threat, is very good. Is very good to exploit for China's strategic interests. It has nothing to do with whether or not the Pakistanis are, brave and courageous people, and whether they are, they have, in a sense, evolved in a different way than the Indians, after 1947. I don't think that's the case. And in many, in many ways, not publicly, but in, for example, private conversations, a lot of the Chinese scholars whom we come across do express very, disparaging views about Pakistan and Pakistanis. But that does not mean that, they are they do not recognize the value of Pakistan as an ally. It has very little to do with what they think about the character of the Pakistani people.
We'll combine last three questions by Professor Tansen Sen, Ambassador Saurav Kumar, Ambassador Suresh Goel, in that order. Tansen, can we start with you?
Sure. Thank you, Ambassador Kanta, and thank you, Ambassador Saran, for the great lecture. My take on the colonial period connections between India and China is slightly different. I think it's the most interesting period, actually. Having worked on the Buddhist period, I think the colonial period is more fascinating than the Buddhist one, given that there were multiple levels of contacts. You are talking mostly about the state level views and connections. Kang Youwei was a state person. There is, in the work of Madhvi Thampi, for example, who is here, diasporic connections, and there's a Chinese diaspora in India as well, and their views and their contacts with the countries that they were in is actually quite fascinating. So I would suggest to move beyond the statist views that, as you pointed out correctly through the British colonial records, is actually problematic looking at the colonial period. I think that has been an issue. And in this regard, I would point to Matthew Mosca's work that dates from before the Opium War, how the Qing dynasty was actually engaging with India, and there was the presence of Indian Muslims and other Indian merchants in various parts of the Qing before the Opium War, and their role in connecting various parts of China and India. I think that's more fascinating. But more pertinent to what you were talking about, the negative views, actually, there is a context to it. And this is one of the problems that we face when we do India-China. It seems that other than India, there's no other country that was a concern to China. So the lost civilization or that you are talking about, it's not only about India. Turkey is part of that. There is a view that civilizations like Egypt, Turkey, and India have lost to colonial powers. And they are trying to explain why that may have happened, why a great country or great civilization as India was not able to defend itself against the British colonial power. Same with Turkey. It's not just India. So here, I think Rebecca Carl's book is actually very, very important. It's called Staging the World. India is just one part of the world that the Chinese are viewing. And so I think there is a context which again is different from the Republican period views of India, and which is again different from the PRC views of India. So the negative perception is not the same. The views about Tagore, as you point out, is among the Marxists. And there are people who have positive views about Tagore. So I think what is needed for this negative view is the background or the context of what's happening in China during this time to understand why they have the negative perceptions in different times during post-Opium War. I think that is what is important to understand the rationale for the negative view and how it fits into other Chinese views of other parts of the world. And here again, I think it's important to look at some of the scholarship, including the views about the Sikhs in Shanghai. I'm talking to you from Shanghai. My suggestion is to look at the context rather than just point out India, China generally.
Before we invite Ambassador Shyam Saran to respond, let's take questions from Saurav and Suresh. Saurav?
Well, I'll actually prefer to withdraw Ashok in view of point considering. Just to make a small point, I had also covered the same thing. See, I think Shyam, very superb lecture, but I take Sujan's point. I think we are conflating the older view, which you documented very well, the bit based on stray images, and giving it to the ideological view. The ideological view needs to be studied separately in more detail. And it's grafted on that older view, but it is not just a continuation of that or just that. And in particular, there comes in study of Gandhi. We need to study more of Chinese sources. It can't be that they have very few. A whole movement and an approach has to be studied and explained to their people. And it's not just satyagraha or what. The question of the moral question in life, in revolution. So how could a book like How to Be a Good Communist be written by Liu Shaoqi without reference to the revolution in the inner conscience of a person which symbolized Gandhi's approach? Unless it is so complete a doctrine, which itself will speak a lot and substantiate the inferiority. So there's lots more to it. I'm sorry.
To the point, my question is really whether Chinese perceptions of India, they emanate from a sense of cultural superiority or a desire to dominate politically. Because I was really wondering from what Townsend said, is there any particular civilization or society in the world which Chinese have ever admired or have an appreciation for? Thank you.
Back to you, sir.
Yeah, the only civilization and culture that was perhaps seen as an alternate center of civilization was in fact India. So even at a time when the Tianxia or the all under heaven was China, and the center of civilization in the known world, the world known to China, was in fact China itself. India came into their consciousness as a different centrality. I mean, there was even if you look at Faxian, he talks about India as the Madhya Desh, in fact as the central country, and China being on the periphery. So if there was any country which was seen as, and any civilization which was seen as at least a parallel and alternate civilization, it was India. And the fact that Buddhism came from India into China was also therefore a recognition that something superior was outside which China was adopting. Of course, this itself underwent a lot of change in China, so that by the time you come to the medieval period, China is projecting itself as an alternate Buddhist universe, with its own places of pilgrimage, with its own sacred landscapes related to Buddhism. You have even, Indian pilgrims going to Buthai Shan because Buthai Shan has emerged as a kind of a very important space of pilgrimage. So yes, was there any other culture or civilization which was looked upon by China as being in fact at least a parallel center of civilization? Yes, it was India. And therefore, in that context, the change that takes place later on is in fact quite notable. The images of India, and even as I pointed out in my talk, that even with respect to Buddhism, you have a sort of narrative which is being put forward that this is what actually enfeebled China. So there is that strain of thinking as well. Husserl, for example, does make that point, that in a sense Buddhism spiritually disarmed China, and therefore it has to be eliminated. So that is one point. Second, as far as what Saurabh has said, this is a half an hour lecture. I cannot go into a whole thesis about different strands of thinking. Of course, I think it is very worthwhile looking at the ideological factor, How much was this closely related to the whole left-wing movement and Marxism in China? My own impression is, and I'm not a researcher, I'm not a scholar, so what I'm saying is based on my own readings of this particular period. My sense is what I said, that it was not limited only to the left-wing intellectuals. It was a perception which was more widely shared. And the second point that I made was that there may have been some positive encounters between Indians and Chinese during this colonial period. But the fact that you had Indians being used as policemen, as soldiers by the British did create and left a fairly negative residue in the minds of even the common people in China. So it is not only something that is limited to just a few intellectuals. Were there positive encounters during this particular period? Of course there were. I acknowledge that at the individual level there were very positive encounters. In fact, the Chinese scholars who came to India, to Shantiniketan, they looked upon India as a land of culture, as a land of knowledge from which they could learn, and explored the history of very positive encounters between India and China. So this is not to say that, oh, it is only negative. But I think it is important to look at that strain of thought amongst the Chinese. Let us look at the positive elements also. There are positive elements, but my purpose of this lecture was to try and highlight how within a certain strong section of Chinese society, the image of India was as a teacher by negative example. India's present at that time was the future that China must avoid. That is a very, very common theme that we see. If there are other strains in the thinking, yes, let us please explore those.
May I now invite Professor Srimati Chakrabarti, Vice Chairperson of Institute of Chinese Studies, to deliver the vote of thanks and offer concluding remarks.
I had the pleasant and enjoyable task of delivering the vote of thanks. But before that, let me say that I was very fortunate to be a student of Professor Vidya. When I was doing political science in Delhi University, I did a course on China and revolution. And that was a common course for students of history as well as political science. And he was a wonderful teacher. I greatly enjoyed being in his class. And later on, of course, my association with him increased when I joined the Department of Chinese and Japanese Studies. He was my senior colleague for 12 years and was always supportive of me. And that is the reason, why I feel that he deserves to be remembered. He's not just because of being supportive to me, but because of his contribution to the Department of East Asian Studies and to the overall growth of China studies in India. Every year we do this event in April. That is the month he passed away in 2011. This year also we were planning to do it in April, but Ambassador Shyam Saran was to deliver the lecture, but for reasons known to all of you, we could not do it. Sometime in August, I thought, how about trying now? And I approached Ambassador Shyam Saran and very graciously agreed to do it on October 7th, and therefore we have this lecture today. So first I want to thank Ambassador Shyam Saran for an excellent presentation, for opening our eyes in many ways, and for letting us be aware of the misperceptions that the Chinese have had of India during the colonial period. In fact, those who analyze foreign policy must know these things. Otherwise, understanding China becomes a real problem. So thank you very much, Ambassador, for this very, very insightful and meaningful presentation this evening. And next, I would like to thank the audience, the participants, for being here today in large numbers. We had about 147 people in all, and also for your very good, intelligent questions. And for the number of people that we had, I have to thank the IIC director, Mr. Srivastava, because IIC did excellent publicity for this event, publicity that it deserves. And IIC has been very supportive of ICS, for many, many years. And as you heard, we are going to have more events together. And next, I want to thank the ICS Director, Ambassador Ashok and his team, Assistant Director Madhurima Nandi, and the 3 young researchers, Samanvay Inda, Aditya Kachia, and Rija Nair, for doing all the groundwork. And last but not the least, I want to thank Anuradha Dutt for supporting this event year after year. And not only this event, Anuradha has supported ICS in different ways earlier also, and continues to do so. So thank you very much, Anuradha. Thanks very much for being present at this event today. So with these words, I end my vote of thanks. Have a pleasant evening and stay safe, stay healthy.